Pfizer and Moderna are now they're now testing. They've now said that they're testing their vaccines. I would prefer to call them experimental medical products, but they're testing those products for their impact on myocarditis, which is the disease that causes inflammation of the heart, and that inflammation can lead to scarring and permanent damage to the heart. And it's definitely something you don't want, and it's definitely something you don't want if you're a youngster, because the heart muscle you're born with is the only heart muscle you're ever going to have. And if that heart muscle if you lose a bit of muscle when you're 10, you're without it for the rest of your life. So when anyone talks about mild myocarditis, turn around and walk away. But finally, Pfizer and Moderna are looking into that. They're looking into their products in relation to myocarditis. So this is out in the public domain now. It's worth pointing out that just weeks ago, if I mentioned here or anywhere else on television, if I put those medical products in the same sentence as myocarditis, it risked censure. It risked legal action. People around me on television would have heart palpitations, appropriately enough, because I had put Pfizer in the same sentence as myocarditis. But now they're talking about it. Now they have accepted that they're going to look into myocarditis in relation to their products. And so what you've got there is that those with meaningful power, those that wield the power in our society, in this case Big Pharma, because they've changed their tune and got into the vibe of let's ask some questions, let's have a discussion about this, then the acceptable truth changes at the same time. It shimmers in front of our eyes. That which was libelous and defamatory, allegedly, a few weeks ago, is now transformed into a legitimate topic of conversation. That's my concern this week in a nutshell. It's about how long do we, the demos, the proles, the public, have to wait, quietly knowing something, talking about something behind closed hands, before it's magically transformed into something that we're allowed to talk about in public. That's the pattern now. We whisper about something that we know to be true. We're shouted down and censured and silenced if we say it in public. But then if you just wait long enough, the truth will out. Like that thing about, they were able to come out there with their claims right out of the box that the vaccination jabs were 100% safe and 100% effective. That was right out of the box. And then those of us that were paying attention to data and reading other things, we realised very early on that was not the case. But to suggest as much was to invite yourself into a whole world of hurt. And so this way in which the truth is not the truth anymore, unless powerful people say that it's the truth, and conversations are not to be had by the likes of us unless they are, first of all, sanctioned by those powers that be. The truth has got away from us. Well, the truth is being stolen from us and sold back to us as something else. Look at COP27, where all our lords and masters flew into Egypt on their private jets and sat down to dinners of beef and chicken and salmon and sea bass and cream sauces, while they lectured us about cutting our carbon emissions and told us to get ready to eat bugs because livestock wasn't for the likes of us. And at that same gathering of the self-important, that incessant talk about green energy, which is not the least bit green, not when you look into it. Everything that makes that green energy, the wind turbines, the solar panels and the rest, is massively intrusive and destructive of ecosystems and environments, not to mention the lives of those that live in the vicinity of resources like lithium and cobalt. But in any event, massive amounts of energy are required for green energy, the batteries for electric vehicles and all the rest of it. And the problem is enormously exacerbated by the behaviour now of the mainstream media, which just trots out the lies and the half-truths without ever bothering to challenge the heart of the narrative. They don't bother themselves with, or they're just, it's not that they don't bother, because they're in the pocket of the same big transnational corporations. You know, ultimately these things, the chain of command goes all the way up to the same suspects, Vanguard, BlackRock and State Street. So they're only allowed to print what they're allowed to say. And so there's no use looking at the mainstream media for truth. It begs the question, was it ever appropriate to look to the mainstream media for the truth? I don't know, because I was asleep then. And it reminds me of, again, another thing that it connects me to is New Zealand's Jacinda Ardern started trotting out months ago, right in the thick of pandemic, that she and her government were to be regarded as the only source of truth. At least in New Zealand. Perhaps she meant in the whole world. Who could tell? Such was that woman's self-importance. And implicit in that idea that the government is the only source of truth is the notion that the truth is a malleable commodity that can be altered and reshaped at the will of the powerful to suit whatever happens to the agenda of the moment. And also, I suppose, you know, we busy ourselves, concern ourselves here in this space with the way in which the past echoes the present, or the present echoes the past, whichever way around you want to put it. So it made me think about Richard Nixon. Now, he was the 37th President of the United States, and in June 1972, which is like a lifetime ago now, but it was in my childhood, he sent 5 men to burgle the headquarters of the Democratic Party in the Watergate building in Washington. The 5 in question were caught, and amongst other things, they were found to be in possession of bugging equipment. At the time, quite high-tech listening devices. They were there to bug their opponent's HQ. Richard Nixon was Republican, and they were there to bug the Democratic offices. Either that, or they had already previously installed something similar and it wasn't working, and they had gone in to try and fix it. But it was an either or, and it later emerged that Nixon's people had bugged and wiretapped all manner of people. Nonetheless, Nixon was actually re-elected by a landslide in the middle of all that in 1972. But the investigations went on, and subsequent revelations led to he was going to be impeached. And anyway, he resigned. He resigned in 1974. In 1977, so just a few years later, he had a book to sell, actually, and his people, those around him, his management, were trying to rehabilitate him in the eyes of the public. And for those reasons, amongst others, he agreed to be interviewed by the English journalist and broadcaster David Frost. And Nixon talked about, in the course of one of the interviews, he was interviewed for days and days and days, or, you know, over a period of days, and he told the story about how he had authorised the burglary on the grounds that it was in the national interest of the people of the United States. And Frost then asked Nixon to clarify whether or not he was saying that, and I quote, in certain situations where the president can decide that it's in the best interest of the nation or something and do something illegal. So Frost said, are you saying that you can do illegal things if you want? And Nixon actually replied and said, well, when the president does it, that means it's not illegal. Now, I think that is what's resonating here in the present. If the takeaway president, if the people with power do it, it means it's not illegal. And if you open your consciousness, if you open your heart to that idea, well, everything's different from that moment on. If we are ready to accept that if a powerful figure does it, then by association and by definition, it's legal. That opens up a whole Pandora's box of potential problems. And back then, back in the 70s, famously, the media got involved in Richard Nixon's downfall. Woodward and Bernstein were 2 young newspaper reporters, and they got in. They started sniffing around. Now, we know now that too much was made of Woodward and Bernstein's role. There was a movie. They wrote a book about it called All the President's Men, and then it was kind of, the role was sexed up in the book, and then there was a movie that starred Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford as Woodward and Bernstein, and so it added glamour to their story, and it became lodged in the public consciousness that these two young men alone had brought down the American president. Now, they themselves rubbished that as an idea. They said they hadn't, and in truth, rather than uncovering much, they were really having information leaked to them by the FBI and others who were already investigating Richard Nixon. So rather than finding the information themselves, in large part they were conduits for information that was coming from those bodies already tasked with investigating what Nixon had been up to. But it changed. I mean, all manner of young people changed course and became journalists because they were so inspired by the story of Woodward and Bernstein. And it even became quite the thing for journalists, investigative journalists, to call themselves muckrakers. That was the nickname that they gave themselves because they were going through the metaphorical bins in search of the truth, however uncomfortable. And okay, so the point is that the media were involved, but I don't know now why anyone would work in mainstream journalism. So different is it? It's not journalism now, it's just pure propaganda. Just name it. The way in which the story of the vaccines was portrayed by the mainstream media, the efficacy, the whole narrative of, if you don't take this for yourself, take it for the broader community because it will stop transmission. And so if you don't submit to the jab, you're a granny killer. That was a lie. And yet it was the mainstream media that circulated that and embedded it in people's consciousness to the extent that some people still think it. And it's across the piece. The coverage of the war in Ukraine is less than complete, let's say. The coverage of the climate, the so-called climate crisis, it's making billions. The green energy revolution is making billions for the usual suspects, while lies and misinformation is zealously covered up by the media. And, I think there used to be, within the media was always partisan. In this country, it's the same. I mean, when I was growing up, you could rely on the fact that, say, the Daily Mail was Conservative and the Daily Mirror was Labour. So, and both of those points of view and propaganda, if you like, from both sides was inhabiting the same ecosystem. And you could sort of pick between, you could choose either or, but both were there and you could sort of take them or leave them. But now, there isn't any of that left and right, Conservative and Labour distinction. The media just exists to push the establishment narrative because left and right no longer exists. You couldn't slip a cigarette paper between Labour and Conservative now in terms of what they would do if they had their chance. They're both the same. The pigs and the human beings of Animal Farm, it's now impossible for us, the animals, to tell the difference between them. So there's only, where there used to be two narratives, two different doses of different propaganda, now there's only one. It's not about left and right anymore, it's about, right and wrong. And I invite you to decide for yourself who you think's right and who you think's wrong. And you see it again in the United States. If you look now at or more recently at what happened to Trump, when Trump was in power, the media were all over him. He was being hunted down by investigative journalists, in inverted commas, if you want to put it that way. But it was entirely different from the way they treat, the Democrat president, poor old sippy cup Joe Biden. He gets a completely different roll of the dice from the media. There wasn't a pro-Trump media in the mainstream, but all of the media is pro-Biden. It's got that one-sided feel about it. And you've only got to look back at the way Trump was treated. There was all that talk of Russian collusion, that Trump had been elected because he was in bed with the Russians and that they had somehow perverted the election process. And Hillary Clinton harped on and on about the fact that Trump was in collusion with the Russians, and that was a lie. none of it stood up in the end. Everyone had to, all of the intelligence agencies that investigated everything about Donald Trump eventually had to come out and say that there was absolutely no evidence of collusion. But it was so mythologised at the time that millions of Americans and others who didn't keep up with the actual truth still think Trump colluded with the Russians to get elected. But then fast forward to the Biden administration and the case of Hunter Biden's laptop. Now, that was just roundly dismissed by that same media. You know, that same media that had so monstered Donald Trump and accused him of being in bed with the Russians when he wasn't. The Hunter Biden laptop story was completely quashed by the media and the technocrats. It was dismissed as Russian propaganda. And yet now we know that not only does the Hunter laptop absolutely exist, it is full of incriminating stuff about the Bidens. But even though we know that now, the media, that same media that is so biased, that only reports one side of the story, doesn't talk about it. The problem we have now, in short, is that the mainstream media here, in the UK, for example, the mainstream media here are working with the powers that be to persuade us, the proles, that whatever it is we're being told at any given moment is the truth. It's a rolling programme of this is the truth. But those of us who are paying attention are increasingly realising that it's only a matter of waiting, a matter of time, weeks, months, maybe years, until at some point it finally suits the powers that be to tell us what the truth is now. And as soon as they give the version of the truth that is what we the proles suspected it was all along, we're finally allowed to talk about it. And there's a pretense that, you know, after all, it was like this all along. I don't know what you're so worried about. And it's become the absolute realisation, the manifestation of an abusive relationship. You know, I've said this before, but if you look at what the government with the mainstream media in absolute collusion are doing, they lie, they gaslight us, tell us, you know, they tell us that we've gone mad, that we're mad people for asking questions and thinking what we think. And then when the truth comes out, they ask for an amnesty and say we should take them back. Now, that's the same as a wife-beating, partner-beating guy saying, I only did what I did to you because I love you and you made me do it, but now can I come back into the house? This is an abusive relationship that we are in. You know, the powers that be are always like this. I think governments are always like this. There's always corruption there. There's always self-interest there. But previously, to some extent, we were protected by something like the mainstream media because it spoke with more than one voice. You had The Sun, you had the Mail, you had the Telegraph, you had the Guardian. You could decide which one you were going to believe, but at least you got different versions and different accounts of the same story. Now all we get are corrupt administrations that are in the pocket of, or are at the very least answerable only to the markets and the banks. They push out a narrative, and the media in its entirety pushes that line without challenge. The truth in block capitals and painted red, the truth. We have to go looking for that elsewhere because we're not getting it from our government, and we're not getting it from the opposition, and we're not getting it from the mainstream media. From them collectively, we're getting a narrative that suits them at the time, and then it changes, and then they say, no, this is the truth. And there was never any reason to be worried about what we said before. There's no reason to be worried about it now. Just accept this latest version of events. And the media click in behind it in lockstep and say the same thing. So if you think you're going mad, there's good reason, because you're being deliberately driven mad by colluding, corrupt authorities and media.